Chapters 75 and 76 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 75. A Ramble Through the Settlement. The following morning, making our toilets carefully, we donned our sombreros and sallied out on a tour. Without meaning to reveal our designs upon the court, our principal object was, to learn what chances there were for white men to obtain employment under the Queen. On this head, it is true, we had questioned Po-Po, but his answers had been very discouraging, so we determined to obtain further information elsewhere. But first, to give some little description of the village. The settlement of Partoowye is nothing more than some 80 houses, scattered here and there, in the midst of an immense grove, where the trees have been thinned out and the underbrush cleared away. Through the grove flows a stream, and the principal avenue crosses it over an elastic bridge of cocoanut trunks laid together side by side. The avenue is broad and serpentine, well shaded from one end to the other, and as pretty a place for a morning promenade as any lounger could wish. The houses, constructed without the slightest regard to the road, peep into view from among the trees on either side, some looking you right in the face as you pass, and others, without any manners, turning their backs. Occasionally, you observe a rural retreat, enclosed by a picket of bamboos, or with a solitary pane of glass massively framed in the broad side of a dwelling, or with a rude, strange-looking door, swinging upon dislocated wooden hinges. Otherwise, the dwellings are built in the original style of the natives, and, never mind how mean and filthy some of them may appear within, they all look picturesque enough without. As we sauntered along, the people we met saluted us pleasantly, and invited us into their houses, and in this way we made a good many brief morning calls. But the hour could not have been the fashionable one in Partoowye, since the ladies were invariably in dishabille. However, they in all cases gave us a cordial reception, and were particularly polite to the doctor, caressing him and amorously hanging about his neck, wonderfully taken up, in short, with a gay handkerchief he wore there. Afriti had that morning bestowed it upon the pious youth. With some exceptions, the general appearance of the natives of Partoowye was far better than that of the inhabitants of Papeetee, a circumstance only to be imputed to their restricted intercourse with foreigners. Strolling on, we turned a sweep of the road when the doctor gave a start, and no wonder. Right before us in the grove was a block of houses, regular square frames boarded over, furnished with windows and doorways, and 2 stories high. We ran up, and found them fast going to decay, very dingy, and here and there covered with moss, no sashes nor doors, and on one side the entire block had settled down nearly a foot. On going into the basement, we looked up clean through the unboarded timbers to the roof, where rays of light, glimmering through many a chink, illuminated the cobwebs which swung all round. The whole interior was dark and close. Burrowing among some old mats in one corner, like a parcel of gypsies in a ruin, were a few vagabond natives. They had their dwelling here. Curious to know who on earth could have been thus trying to improve the value of real estate in Partoowye, we made inquiries, and learned that some years previous, the block had been thrown up by a veritable Yankee, one might have known that, a house carpenter by trade, and a bold enterprising fellow by nature. Put ashore from his ship, sick, he first went to work and got well, then sallied out with chisel and plane and made himself generally useful. A sober, steady man, it seems, he at last obtained the confidence of several chiefs, and soon filled them with all sorts of ideas concerning the alarming want of public spirit in the people of Eimeo. More especially did he dwell upon the humiliating fact of their living in paltry huts of bamboo, when magnificent palaces of boards might so easily be morticed together. In the end, these representations so far prevailed with one old chief, that the carpenter was engaged to build a batch of these wonderful palaces. Provided with plenty of men, he at once set to work; built a sawmill among the mountains, felled trees, and sent over to Papeetee for nails. Presto! The castle rose; but alas, the roof was hardly on, when the Yankee's patron, having speculated beyond his means, broke all to pieces, and was absolutely unable to pay one plug of tobacco in the pound. His failure involved the carpenter, who sailed away from his creditors in the very next ship that touched at the harbor. The natives despised the rickety palace of boards, and often lounged by, wagging their heads and jeering. We were told that the queen's residence was at the extreme end of the village; so, without waiting for the doctor to procure a fiddle, we suddenly resolved upon going thither at once, and learning whether any privy councilorships were vacant. Now, although there was a good deal of my waggish comrade's nonsense about what has been said concerning our expectations of court preferment, we, nevertheless, really thought that something to our advantage might turn up in that quarter. Upon approaching the palace grounds, we found them rather peculiar. A broad pier of hewn coral rocks was built right out into the water; and upon this, and extending into the grove adjoining, were some 8 or 10 very large native houses, constructed in the handsomest style, and enclosed together by a low picket of bamboos, which embraced a considerable area. Throughout the Society Islands, the residences of the chiefs are mostly found in the immediate vicinity of the sea, a site which gives them the full benefit of a cooling breeze, nor are they so liable to the annoyance of insects, besides enjoying when they please the fine shade afforded by the neighboring groves, always most luxuriant near the water. Lounging about the grounds were some 60 or 80 handsomely dressed natives, men and women; some reclining on the shady side of the houses, others under the trees, and a small group conversing close by the railing, facing us. We went up to the latter, and giving the usual salutation, were on the point of vaulting over the bamboos, when they turned upon us angrily, and said we could not enter. We stated our earnest desire to see the queen, hinting that we were bearers of important dispatches; but it was to no purpose, and not a little vexed, we were obliged to return to Popo's without effecting anything. Chapter 76. An Island Jilt. We Visit the Ship. Upon arriving home, we fully laid open to Popo our motives in visiting Taloo, and begged his friendly advice. In his broken English, he cheerfully gave us all the information we needed. It was true, he said, that the queen entertained some idea of making a stand against the French, and it was currently reported also that several chiefs from Bora Bora, Huwaini, Raiatea, and Tahar, the leeward islands of the group, were at that very time taking counsel with her as to the expediency of organizing a general movement throughout the entire cluster, with a view of anticipating any further encroachments on the part of the invaders. Should warlike measures be actually decided upon, it was quite certain that Pomaree would be glad to enlist all the foreigners she could. But as to her making officers of either the doctor or me, that was out of the question, because already a number of the Europeans, well known to her, had volunteered as such. Concerning our getting immediate access to the queen, Popo told us it was altogether doubtful. She living at that time very retired, in poor health and spirits, and averse to receiving calls. Previous to her misfortunes, however, no one, however humble, was denied admittance to her presence. Sailors even attended her levees. Not at all disheartened by these things, we concluded to kill time in Partoowye until some event turned up more favorable to our projects. So that very day we sallied out on an excursion to the ship, which, lying landlocked, far up the bay, yet remained to be visited. Passing on our route a long, low shed, a voice hailed us, "White men, ahoy!" Turning round, who should we see but a rosy-cheeked Englishman, you could tell his country at a glance, up to his knees in shavings, and planing away at a bench. He turned out to be a runaway ship's carpenter, recently from Tahiti, and now doing a profitable business in Eimeo, by fitting up the dwellings of opulent chiefs with cupboards and other conveniences, and once in a while trying his hand at a lady's work-box. He had been in the settlement but a few months, and already possessed houses and lands. But though blessed with prosperity and high health, there was one thing wanting, a wife. And when he came to speak of the matter, his countenance fell, and he leaned dejectedly upon his plane. "It's too bad," he sighed, "to wait 3 long years, and all the while dear little Lullee living in the same house with that infernal chief from Tahar." Our curiosity was piqued. The poor carpenter, then, had been falling in love with some island coquette, who was going to jilt him. But such was not the case. There was a law prohibiting, under a heavy penalty, the marriage of a native with a foreigner, unless the latter, after being 3 years a resident on the island, was willing to affirm his settled intention of remaining for life. William was therefore in a sad way. He told us that he might have married the girl 6 times, had it not been for this odious law. But latterly she had become less loving and more giddy, particularly with the strangers from Tahar. Desperately smitten, and desirous of securing her at all hazards, he had proposed to the damsel's friends a nice little arrangement, introductory to marriage; but they would not hear of it. Besides, if the pair were discovered living together on such a footing, they would be liable to a degrading punishment, sent to work making stone walls and opening roads for the queen. Dr. Longghost was all sympathy. "Bill, my good fellow," said he tremulously, "let me go and talk to her." But Bill, declining the offer, would not even inform us where his charmer lived. Leaving the disconsolate Willie planing a plank of New Zealand pine, an importation from the Bay of Islands, and thinking the while of Lullee, we went on our way. How his suit prospered in the end, we never learned. Going from Popo's house toward the anchorage of the harbor of Taloo, you catch no glimpse of the water until coming out from deep groves, you all at once find yourself upon the beach. A bay, considered by many voyagers the most beautiful in the South Seas, then lies before you. You stand upon one side of what seems a deep, green river, flowing through mountain passes to the sea. Right opposite, a majestic promontory divides the inlet from another, called after its discoverer, Captain Cook. The face of this promontory toward Taloo is one verdant wall, and at its base the waters lie still and fathomless. On the left hand, you just catch a peep of the widening mouth of the bay, the break in the reef by which ships enter, and beyond, the sea. To the right, the inlet, sweeping boldly round the promontory, runs far away into the land, where, save in one direction, the hills close in on every side, knee-deep in verdure, and shooting aloft in grotesque peaks. The open space lies at the head of the bay. In the distance it extends into a broad, hazy plain, lying at the foot of an amphitheater of hills. Here is the large sugar plantation previously alluded to. Beyond the first range of hills, you descry the sharp pinnacles of the interior, and among these, the same silent marling-spike, which we so often admired from the other side of the island. All alone in the harbor lay the good ship Leviathan. We jumped into the canoe and paddled off to her. Though early in the afternoon, everything was quiet; but upon mounting the side, we found 4 or 5 sailors lounging about the forecastle under an awning. They gave us no very cordial reception, and though otherwise quite hearty in appearance, seemed to assume a look of ill humor on purpose to honor our arrival. There was much eagerness to learn whether we wanted to ship, and by the unpleasant accounts they gave of the vessel, they seemed desirous to prevent such a thing if possible. We asked where the rest of the ship's company were. A gruff old fellow made answer: "One boat's crew of 'em is gone to Davy Jones's locker. Went off after a whale, last cruise, and never came back again. All the starboard watch ran away last night, and the skipper's ashore kitching 'em." "And it's shipping you're after, my jewels, is it?" cried a curly-pated little Belfast sailor, coming up to us. "Then arrah! my livelies, just be after sailing ashore in a jiffy. The devil of a skipper will carry yees both to sea, whether or no. Be off with ye, then, darlints, and steer clear of the likes of this ballyhoo of blazes as long as ye live. They murther us here every day, and starve us into the bargain. Here, Dick, lad, harl the poor divil's canoe alongside, and paddle away wid yees for dear life." But we loitered awhile, listening to more inducements to ship, and at last concluded to stay to supper. My sheath knife never cut into a better sea beef than that which we found lying in the kid in the forecastle. The bread, too, was hard, dry, and brittle as glass, and there was plenty of both. While we were below, the mate of the vessel called out for someone to come on deck. I liked his voice. Hearing it was as good as a look at his face. It betokened a true sailor, and no taskmaster. The appearance of the Leviathan herself was quite pleasing. Like all large comfortable old whalemen, she had a sort of motherly look, broad in the beam, flush decks, and 4 chubby boats hanging at the breast. Her sails were furled loosely upon the yards, as if they had been worn long and fitted easy. Her shrouds swung negligently slack, and as for the running rigging, it never worked hard as it does in some of your dandy ships, jamming in the sheaves of blocks, like Chinese slippers, too small to be useful. On the contrary, the ropes ran glibly through, as if they had many a time traveled the same road and were used to it. When evening came, we dropped into our canoe and paddled ashore, fully convinced that the good ship never deserved the name which they gave her. End of chapters 75 and 76. Recording by Trisha G. Chapters 77 and 78 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 77. A Party of Rovers, Little Lou and the Doctor. While in Partoowye, we fell in with a band of 6 veteran rovers, prowling about the village and harbor, who had just come overland from another part of the island. A few weeks previous, they had been paid off at Papeetee from a whaling vessel, on board of which they had, 6 months before, shipped for a single cruise, that is to say, to be discharged at the next port. Their cruise was a famous one, and each man stepped upon the beach at Tahiti, jingling his dollars in a sock. Weary at last of the shore, and having some money left, they clubbed and purchased a sailboat, proposing a visit to a certain uninhabited island, concerning which they had heard strange and golden stories. Of course, they never could think of going to sea without a medicine chest filled with flasks of spirits, and a small cask of the same in the hold, in case the chest should give out. Away they sailed, hoisted a flag of their own, and gave 3 times 3 as they staggered out of the bay of Papeetee with a strong breeze, and under all the muslin they could carry. Evening coming on, and feeling in high spirits, and no ways disposed to sleep, they concluded to make a night of it, which they did, all hands getting tipsy, and the 2 masts going over the side about midnight, to the tune of sailing down, on the coast of Barbary. Fortunately, one worthy could stand, by holding on to the tiller, and the rest managed to crawl about, and hack away the lanyards of the rigging, so as to break clear from the fallen spars. While thus employed, 2 sailors got tranquilly over the side, and went plumb to the bottom, under the erroneous impression that they were stepping upon an imaginary wharf to get at their work better. After this it blew quite a gale, and the Commodore, at the helm, instinctively kept the boat before the wind, and by so doing ran over to the opposite island of Imeeo. Crossing the channel, by almost a miracle they went straight through an opening in the reef, and shot upon a ledge of coral where the waters were tolerably smooth. Here they lay until morning, when the natives came off to them in their canoes. By the help of the islanders, the schooner was hove over on her beam ends, when, finding the bottom knocked to pieces, the adventurers sold the boat for a trifle to the chief of the district, and went ashore, rolling before them their precious cask of spirits. Its contents soon evaporated, and they came to Partoowye. The day after encountering these fellows, we were strolling among the groves in the neighborhood, when we came across several parties of natives, armed with clumsy muskets, rusty cutlasses, and outlandish clubs. They were beating the bushes, shouting aloud, and apparently trying to scare somebody. They were in pursuit of the strangers, who, having in a single night set at naught all the laws of the place, had thought best to decamp. In the daytime, Popo's house was as pleasant a lounge as one could wish. So after strolling about, and seeing all there was to be seen, we spent the greater part of our mornings there, breakfasting late and dining about 2 hours after noon. Sometimes we lounged on the floor of ferns, smoking, and telling stories, of which the doctor had as many as a half-pay captain in the army. Sometimes we chatted as well as we could with the natives, and one day, joy to us, Popo brought in 3 volumes of Smollett's novels, which had been found in the chest of a sailor who some time previous had died on the island. Amelia, Peregrine, you hero of rogues, Count Fathom, what a debt do we owe you! I know not whether it was the reading of these romances, or the want of some sentimental pastime which led the doctor, about this period, to lay siege to the heart of the little Loo. Now, as I have said before, the daughter of Popo was most cruelly reserved, and never deigned to notice us. Frequently I addressed her with a long face and an air of the profoundest and most distant respect, but in vain. She wouldn't even turn up her pretty olive nose. Ah, it's quite plain, thought I, she knows very well what graceless dogs sailors are, and won't have anything to do with us. But thus thought not my comrade. Bent he was upon firing the cold glitter of Loo's passionless eyes. He opened the campaign with admirable tact, making cautious approaches, and content, for 3 days, with ogling the nymph for about 5 minutes after every meal. On the 4th day he asked her a question. On the 5th she dropped a nut of ointment, and he picked it up and gave it to her. On the 6th he went over and sat down within 3 yards of the couch where she lay, and, on the memorable morn of the 7th, he proceeded to open his batteries in form. The damsel was reclining on the ferns, one hand supporting her cheek, and the other listlessly turning over the leaves of a Tahitian Bible. The doctor approached. Now the chief disadvantage under which he labored was his almost complete ignorance of the love vocabulary of the island. But French counts, they say, make love delightfully in broken English, and what hindered the doctor from doing the same in dulcet Tahitian? So at it he went. "Ah," said he, smiling bewitchingly, "Owe missionary? Owe ready Bibli?" No answer, not even a look. "Ah, mai tai, very goody ready Bibli missionary." Loo, without stirring, began reading in a low tone to herself. "Missionary Bibli ready goody mai tai," once more observed the doctor, ingeniously transposing his words for the 3rd time. But all to no purpose. Loo gave no sign. He paused despairingly, but it would never do to give up, so he threw himself at full length beside her, and audaciously commenced turning over the leaves. Loo gave a start, just one little start, barely perceptible, and then, fumbling something in her hand, lay perfectly motionless. The doctor, rather frightened at his own temerity, and knowing not what to do next. At last he placed one arm cautiously about her waist. Almost in the same instant he bounded to his feet with a cry. The little witch had pierced him with a thorn. But there she lay, just as quietly as ever, turning over the leaves and reading to herself. My long friend raised the siege incontinently, and made a disorderly retreat to the place where I reclined, looking on. I am pretty sure that Loo must have related this occurrence to her father, who came in shortly afterward, for he looked queerly at the doctor. But he said nothing, and in 10 minutes was quite affable as ever. As for Loo, there was not the slightest change in her, and the doctor, of course, forever afterwards held his peace. Chapter 78. Mrs. Bell. One day, taking a pensive afternoon stroll along one of the many bridle paths which wind among the shady groves in the neighborhood of Taloo, I was startled by a sunny apparition. It was that of a beautiful young Englishwoman, charmingly dressed, and mounted upon a spirited little white pony. Switching a green branch, she came cantering towards me. I looked round to see whether I could possibly be in Polynesia. There were palm trees, but how to account for the lady? Stepping to one side, as the apparition drew near, I made a polite obeisance. It gave me a bold rosy look, and then, with a gay air, patted its palfrey, crying out, "Fly away, Willie!" and galloped among the trees. I would have followed, but Willie's heels were making such a pattering among the dry leaves, that pursuit would have been useless. So I went straight home to Popo's, and related my adventure to the doctor. The next day, our inquiries resulted in finding out that the stranger had been in the island about 2 years; that she came from Sydney, and was the wife of Mr. Bell (happy dog), the proprietor of the sugar plantation, to which I have previously referred. To the sugar plantation we went the same day. The country round about was very beautiful, a level basin of verdure, surrounded by sloping hillsides. The sugar cane, of which there was about 100 acres, in various stages of cultivation, looked thrifty. A considerable tract of land, however, which seemed to have been formerly tilled, was now abandoned. The place where they extracted the saccharine matter was under an immense shed of bamboos. Here we saw several clumsy pieces of machinery for breaking the cane; also great kettles for boiling the sugar. But at present nothing was going on. 2 or 3 natives were lounging in one of the kettles, smoking. The other was occupied by 3 sailors from the Leviathan, playing cards. While we were conversing with these worthies, a stranger approached. He was a sunburnt, romantic-looking European, dressed in a loose suit of nankeen. His fine throat and chest were exposed, and he sported a Guayaquil hat, with a brim like a Chinese umbrella. This was Mr. Bell. He was very civil, showed us the grounds, and, taking us into a sort of arbor, to our surprise, offered to treat us to some wine. People often do the like, but Mr. Bell did more. He produced the bottle. It was spicy sherry, and we drunk out of the halves of fresh citron melons. Delectable goblets. The wine was a purchase from the French in Tahiti. Now all this was extremely polite in Mr. Bell. Still, we came to see Mrs. Bell. But she proved to be a phantom, indeed having left the same morning for Papeetee, on a visit to one of the missionaries' wives there. I went home much chagrined. To be frank, my curiosity had been wonderfully piqued concerning the lady. In the first place, she was the most beautiful white woman I ever saw in Polynesia. But this is saying nothing. She had such eyes, such moss roses in her cheeks, such a divine air in the saddle, that, to my dying day, I shall never forget Mrs. Bell. The sugar planter himself was young, robust, and handsome. So, merrily may the little Bells increase and multiply, and make Chapters 79 and 80 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 79. Taloo Chapel, Holding Court in Polynesia. In Partoowye is to be seen one of the best constructed and handsomest chapels in the South Seas. Like the buildings of the palace, it stands upon an artificial pier, presenting a semicircular sweep to the bay. The chapel is built of hewn blocks of coral, a substance which, although extremely friable, is said to harden by exposure to the atmosphere. To a stranger, these blocks look extremely curious. Their surface is covered with strange fossil-like impressions, the seal of which must have been set before the flood. Very nearly white when hewn from the reef, the coral darkens with age, so that several churches in Polynesia now look almost as sooty and venerable as famed St. Paul's. In shape the chapel is an octagon, with galleries all round. It will seat perhaps 400 people. Everything within is stained a tawny red, and there being but few windows, or rather embrasures, the dusky benches and galleries, and the tall spectre of the pulpit look anything but cheerful. On Sundays we always went to worship there. Going in the family suite of Popo, we, of course, maintained a most decorous exterior, and hence, by all the elderly people of the village, were doubtless regarded as pattern young men. Popo's seat was in a snug corner, and it being particularly snug, in the immediate vicinity of one of the palm pillars supporting the gallery, I invariably leaned against it. Popo and his lady on one side, the doctor and the dandy on the other, and the children and the poor relations seated behind. As for Loo, instead of sitting, as she ought to have done, by her good father and mother, she must needs run up into the gallery and sit with a parcel of giddy creatures of her own age, who, all through the sermon, did nothing but look down on the congregation, pointing out and giggling at the queer-looking old ladies in dowdy bonnets and scant tunics. But Loo herself was never guilty of these improprieties. Occasionally during the week they have afternoon service in the chapel, when the natives themselves have something to say, although their auditors are but few. An introductory prayer being offered by the missionary, and a hymn sung, communicants rise in their places, and exhort in pure Tahitian, and with wonderful tone and gesture. And among them all, Deacon Popo, though he talked most, was the one whom you would have liked best to hear. Much would I have given to have understood some of his impassioned bursts, when he tossed his arms overhead, stamped, scowled, and glared, till he looked like the very angel of vengeance. "Deluded man," sighed the doctor on one of these occasions. "I fear he takes the fanatical view of the subject." One thing was certain. When Popo spoke, all listened. A great deal more than could be said for the rest, for under the discipline of 2 or 3 I could mention, some of the audience napped, others fidgeted, a few yawned, and one irritable old gentleman in a nightcap of cocoanut leaves used to clutch his long staff in a state of excessive nervousness and stride out of the church, making all the noise he could to emphasize his disgust. Right adjoining the chapel is an immense rickety building with windows and shutters, and a half-decayed board flooring laid upon trunks of palm trees. They called it a schoolhouse, but as such we never saw it occupied. It was often used as a court-room, however, and here we attended several trials, among others, that of a decayed naval officer and a young girl of 14, the latter, charged with having been very naughty on a particular occasion, set forth in the pleadings, and the former with having aided and abetted her in her naughtiness, and with other misdemeanors. The foreigner was a tall, military-looking fellow, with a dark cheek and black whiskers. According to his own account, he had lost a colonial armed brig on the coast of New Zealand, and since then had been leading the life of a man-about-town among the islands of the Pacific. The doctor wanted to know why he did not go home and report the loss of his brig, but Captain Crash, as they called him, had some incomprehensible reasons for not doing so, about which he could talk by the hour, and no one be any the wiser. Probably he was a discreet man, and thought it best to waive an interview with the Lords of the Admiralty. For some time past, this extremely suspicious character had been carrying on an illicit trade in French wines and brandies, smuggled over from the men of war lately touching at Tahiti. In a grove near the anchorage, he had a rustic shanty and arbor, where, in quiet times, when no ships were in Taloo, a stray native once in a while got boozy, and staggered home, catching at the cocoanut trees as he went. The captain himself lounged under a tree during the warm afternoons, pipe in mouth, thinking, perhaps, over old times, and occasionally feeling his shoulders for his lost epaulets. But, sail ho! A ship is descried coming into the bay. Soon she drops her anchor in its waters, and the next day Captain Crash entertains the sailors in his grove. And rare times they have of it, drinking and quarreling together, as sociably as you please. Upon one of these occasions, the crew of the Leviathan made so prodigious a tumult, that the natives, indignant at the insult offered their laws, plucked up a heart, and made a dash at the rioters, 100 strong. The sailors fought like tigers, but were at last overcome, and carried before a native tribunal, which, after a mighty clamor, dismissed everybody but Captain Crash, who was asserted to be the author of the disorders. Upon this charge, then, he had been placed in confinement against the coming on of the assizes, the judge being expected to lounge along in the course of the afternoon. While waiting his Honor's arrival, numerous additional offenses were preferred against the culprit, mostly by the old women. Among others was the bit of a slip in which he stood implicated along with the young lady. Thus, in Polynesia as elsewhere, charge a man with one misdemeanor, and all his peccadilloes are raked up and assorted before him. Going to the schoolhouse for the purpose of witnessing the trial, the din of it assailed our ears a long way off, and upon entering the building we were almost stunned. About 500 natives were present, each, apparently, having something to say, and determined to say it. His Honor, a handsome, benevolent-looking old man, sat cross-legged on a little platform, seemingly resigned with all Christian submission to the uproar. He was an hereditary chief in this quarter of the island, and judge for life in the district of Partoowye. There were several cases coming on, but the captain and girl were first tried together. They were mixing freely with the crowd, and as it afterward turned out that everyone, no matter who, had a right to address the court, for aught we knew they might have been arguing their own case. At what precise moment the trial began, it would be hard to say. There was no swearing of witnesses, and no regular jury. [Footnote: This anomaly exists, notwithstanding that, in other respects, the missionaries have endeavored to organize the native courts upon the English model. End footnote. Now and then somebody leaped up and shouted out something which might have been evidence; the rest, meanwhile, keeping up an incessant jabbering. Presently the old judge himself began to get excited, and, springing to his feet, ran in among the crowd, wagging his tongue as hard as anybody. The tumult lasted about 20 minutes, and toward the end of it Captain Crash might have been seen, tranquilly regarding, from his Honor's platform, the judicial uproar, in which his fate was about being decided. The result of all was this, that both he and the girl were found guilty. The latter was adjudged to make 6 mats for the Queen, and the former, in consideration of his manifold offenses, being deemed incorrigible, was sentenced to eternal banishment from the island. Both these decrees seemed to originate in the general hubbub. His Honor, however, appeared to have considerable authority, and was quite plain that the decision received his approval. The above penalties were by no means indiscriminately inflicted. The missionaries have prepared a sort of penal tariff to facilitate judicial proceedings. It costs so many days' labor on the broom road to indulge in the pleasures of the calabash, so many fathoms of stone wall to steal a musket, and so on to the end of the catalogue. The judge being provided with a book, in which all these matters are cunningly arranged, the thing is vastly convenient. For instance, a crime is proved, say bigamy. Turn to letter B, and there you have it. Bigamy, 40 days on the Broom Road, and 20 mats for the Queen. Read the passage aloud, and sentence is pronounced. After taking part in the first trial, the other delinquents present were put upon their own, in which also the convicted culprits seemed to have quite as much to say as the rest. A rather strange proceeding, but strictly in accordance with the glorious English principle that every man should be tried by his peers. They were all found guilty. Chapter 80. Queen Pomaree. It is well to learn something about the people before being introduced to them, and so we will here give some account of Pomaree and her family. Every reader of Cook's Voyages must remember Omoo, who, in that navigator's time, was king of the larger peninsula of Tahiti. Subsequently, assisted by the muskets of the Bounty's men, he extended his rule over the entire island. This Omoo, before his death, had his name changed into Pomaree, which has ever since been the royal patronymic. He was succeeded by his son, Pomaree II, the most famous prince in the annals of Tahiti. Though a sad debauchee and drunkard, and even charged with unnatural crimes, he was a great friend of the missionaries, and one of their very first proselytes. During the religious wars into which he was hurried by his zeal for the new faith, he was defeated and expelled from the island. After a short exile, he returned from Eimeo with an army of 800 warriors, and, in the battle of Narai, routed the rebellious pagans with great slaughter, and established himself upon the throne. Thus, by force of arms, was Christianity finally triumphant in Tahiti. Pomaree II, dying in 1821, was succeeded by his infant son, under the title of Pomaree III. This young prince survived his father but 6 years, and the government then descended to his older sister, Aimata, the present queen, who is commonly called Pomaree Vahine I, or the first female Pomaree. Her Majesty must be now upwards of 30 years of age. She has been twice married. Her first husband was the son of the old king of Tahar, an island about 100 miles from Tahiti. This proving an unhappy alliance, the pair were soon after divorced. The present husband of the queen is a chief of Eimeo. The reputation of Pomaree is not what it ought to be. She, and also her mother, were, for a long time, excommunicated members of the church, and the former, I believe, still is. Among other things, her conjugal fidelity is far from being unquestioned. Indeed, it was upon this ground chiefly that she was excluded from the communion of the church. Previous to her misfortunes, she spent the greater portion of her time sailing about from one island to another, attended by a licentious court, and wherever she went, all manner of games and festivities celebrated her arrival. She was always given to display. For several years the maintenance of a regiment of household troops drew largely upon the royal exchequer. They were trouserless fellows, in a uniform of calico shirts and pasteboard hats, armed with muskets of all shapes and calibers, and commanded by a great noisy chief, strutting it in a coat of fiery red. These heroes escorted their mistress whenever she went abroad. Some time ago, the Queen received from her English sister, Victoria, a very showy, though uneasy, head-dress, a crown, probably made to order at some tinman's in London. Having no idea of reserving so pretty a bauble for coronation days, which comes so seldom, her Majesty sported it whenever she appeared in public, and, to show her familiarity with European customs, politely touched it to all foreigners of distinction, whaling captains and the like, whom she happened to meet in her evening walk on the Broom Road. The arrival and departure of royalty were always announced at the palace by the court artilleryman, a fat old gentleman, who, in a prodigious hurry and perspiration, discharged minute fowling pieces as fast as he could load and fire the same. The Tahitian princess leads her husband a hard life. Poor fellow! He not only caught a queen, but a Tartar, when he married her. The style by which he is addressed is rather significant: Pomaree Tanee, Pomaree's man. All things considered, as appropriate a title for a king consort as could be hit upon. If ever there was a henpecked husband, that man is the prince. One day, his cara sposa, giving audience to a deputation from the captains of the vessels lying in Papeetee, he ventured to make a suggestion which was very displeasing to her. She turned round, and, boxing his ears, told him to go over to his beggarly island of Eimeo, if he wanted to give himself airs. Cuffed and contemned, poor Tanee flies to the bottle, or rather to the calabash, for solace. Like his wife and mistress, he drinks more than he ought. 6 or 7 years ago, when an American man-of-war was lying at Papeetee, the town was thrown into the greatest commotion by a conjugal assault and battery, made upon the sacred person of Pomaree by her intoxicated Tanee. Captain Bob once told me the story; and by way of throwing more spirit into the description, as well as to make up for his oral deficiencies, the old man went through the accompanying action, myself being proxy for the Queen of Tahiti. It seems that on a Sunday morning, being dismissed contemptuously from the royal presence, Tanee was accosted by certain good fellows, friends and boon companions, who condoled with him on his misfortunes, railed against the Queen, and finally dragged him away to an illicit vendor of spirits, in whose house the party got gloriously mellow. In this state, Pomaree Vahinee the First was the topic upon which all dilated. A vixen of a queen probably suggested one. "It's infamous," said another. "And I'd have satisfaction," cried a third. "And so I will," Tanee must have hiccoughed, for off he went; and ascertaining that his royal half was out riding, he mounted his horse and galloped after her. Near the outskirts of the town a cavalcade of women came cantering towards him, in the center of which was the object of his fury. Smiting his beast right and left, he dashed in among them, completely overturning one of the party, leaving her on the field, and dispersing everybody else except Pomaree. Backing her horse dexterously, the incensed queen heaped upon him every scandalous epithet she could think of, until at last the enraged Tanee leaped out of his saddle, caught Pomaree by her dress, and dragging her to the earth, struck her repeatedly in the face, holding on meanwhile by the hair of her head. He was proceeding to strangle her on the spot, when the cries of the frightened attendants brought a crowd of natives to the rescue, who bore the nearly insensible queen away. But his frantic rage was not yet sated. He ran to the palace, and before it could be prevented, demolished a valuable supply of crockery, a recent present from abroad. In the act of perpetrating some other atrocity, he was seized from behind, and carried off with rolling eyes and foaming at the mouth. This is a fair example of a Tahitian in a passion. Though the mildest of mortals in general, and hard to be roused, when once fairly up, he is possessed with 1,000 devils. The day following, Tanee was privately paddled over to Eimeo in a canoe, where, after remaining in banishment for a couple of weeks, he was allowed to return, and once more give in his domestic adhesion. Though Pomaree Vahinee the First be something of a Jezebel in private life, in her public rule she is said to have been quite lenient and forbearing. This was her true policy; for an hereditary hostility to her family had always lurked in the hearts of many powerful chiefs, the descendants of the old kings of Taiarboo, dethroned by her grandfather Otoo. Chief among these, and in fact the leader of his party, was Poofai, a bold, able man, who made no secret of his enmity to the missionaries and the government which they controlled. But while events were occurring, calculated to favor the hopes of the disaffected and turbulent, the arrival of the French gave a most unexpected turn to affairs. During my sojourn in Tahiti, a report was rife which I knew to originate with what is generally called the missionary party, that Poofi and some of the other chiefs of note had actually agreed, for a stipulated bribe, to acquiesce in the appropriation of their country. But subsequent events have rebutted the calumny. Several of these very men have recently died in battle against the French. Under the sovereignty of the Pomarees, the great chiefs of Tahiti were something like the barons of King John. Holding feudal sway over their patrimonial valleys, and, on account of their descent, warmly beloved by the people, they frequently cut off the royal revenues by refusing to pay the customary tribute due from them as vassals. The truth is, that with the ascendancy of the missionaries, the regal office in Tahiti lost much of its dignity and influence. In the days of paganism, it was supported by all the power of a numerous priesthood, and was solemnly connected with the entire superstitious idolatry of the island. The monarch claimed to be a sort of byblow of Tararoa, the Saturn of the Polynesian mythology, and cousin german to inferior deities. His person was thrice holy. If he entered an ordinary dwelling, never mind for how short a time, it was demolished when he left, no common mortal being thought worthy to inhabit it afterwards. "I'm a greater man than King George," said the incorrigible young Otoo to the first missionaries. "He rides on a horse, and I on a man." Such was the case. He traveled post through his dominions on the shoulders of his subjects, and relays of immortal beings were provided in all the valleys. But alas, how times have changed! How transient human greatness! Some years since, Pomaree Vahini I, the granddaughter of the proud Otoo, went into the laundry business, publicly soliciting, by her agents, the washing of the linen belonging to the officers of ships touching in her harbors. It is a significant fact, and one worthy of record, that while the influence of the English missionaries at Tahiti has tended to so great a diminution of the regal dignity there, that of the American missionaries at the Sandwich Islands has been purposely Chapters 81 and 82 of Omoo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Omoo, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, by Herman Melville. Chapter 81. We Visit the Court. It was about the middle of the second month of the Hegira, and therefore some 5 weeks after our arrival in Partoowye, that we at last obtained admittance to the residence of the Queen. It happened thus. There was a Marquesan in the train of Pomaree, who officiated as nurse to her children. According to the Tahitian custom, the royal youngsters are carried about until it requires no small degree of strength to stand up under them. But Marbona was just the man for this, large and muscular, well made as a statue, and with an arm like a degenerate Tahitian's thigh. Embarking at his native island as a sailor, on board of a French whaler, he afterwards ran away from the ship at Tahiti, where, being seen and admired by Pomaree, he had been prevailed upon to enlist in her service. Often, when visiting the grounds, we saw him walking about in the shade, carrying 2 handsome boys, who encircled his neck with their arms. Marbona's face, tattooed as it was in the ornate style of his tribe, was as good as a picture book to these young Pomarees. They delighted to trace with their fingers the outlines of the strange shapes there delineated. The first time my eyes lighted upon the Marquesan, I knew his country in a moment, and hailing him in his own language, he turned round, surprised that a person so speaking should be a stranger. He proved to be a native of Taior, a glen of Nukuhiva. I had visited the place more than once, and so, on the island of Aimeo, we met like old friends. In my frequent conversations with him over the bamboo picket, I found this islander a philosopher of nature, a wild heathen, moralizing upon the vices and follies of the Christian court of Tahiti. a savage, scorning the degeneracy of the people among whom fortune had thrown him. I was amazed at the national feelings of the man. No European, when abroad, could speak of his country with more pride than Marbona. He assured me again and again that so soon as he had obtained sufficient money to purchase 20 muskets and as many bags of powder, he was going to return to a place with which Eimeo was not worthy to be compared. It was Marbona who, after 1 or 2 unsuccessful attempts, at last brought about our admission into the Queen's grounds. Through a considerable crowd, he conducted us along the pier to where an old man was sitting, to whom he introduced us as a couple of Karhowries of his acquaintance, anxious to see the sights of the palace. The venerable chamberlain stared at us and shook his head. The doctor, thinking he wanted a fee, placed a plug of tobacco in his hand. This was ingratiating, and we were permitted to pass on. Upon the point of entering one of the houses, Marbona's name was shouted in half a dozen different directions, and he was obliged to withdraw. Thus left at the very threshold to shift for ourselves, my companion's assurance stood us in good stead. He stalked right in, and I followed. The place was full of women, who, instead of exhibiting the surprise we expected, accosted us as cordially as if we had called to make our souchong with them by express invitation. In the first place, nothing would do but we must each devour a calabash of poee and several roasted bananas. Pipes were then lighted, and a brisk conversation ensued. These ladies of the court, if not very polished, were surprisingly free and easy in their manners, quite as much so as King Charles's beauties. There was one of them, an arch little miss, who could converse with us pretty fluently, to whom we strove to make ourselves particularly agreeable with the view of engaging her services as cicerone. As such, she turned out to be everything we could desire. No one disputing her will, every place was entered without ceremony, curtains brushed aside, mats lifted, and each nook and corner explored. Whether the little damsel carried her mistress's signet, that everything opened to her thus, I know not, but Marbona himself, the bearer of infants, could not have been half so serviceable. Among other houses which we visited was one of large size and fine exterior, the special residence of a European, formerly the mate of a merchant vessel, who had done himself the honor of marrying into the Pomaree family. The lady he wedded being a near kinswoman of the Queen, he became a permanent member of Her Majesty's household. This adventurer rose late, dressed theatrically in calico and trinkets, assumed a dictatorial tone in conversation, and was evidently upon excellent terms with himself. We found him reclining on a mat, smoking a reed pipe of tobacco, in the midst of an admiring circle of chiefs and ladies. He must have noticed our approach, but instead of rising and offering civilities, he went on talking and smoking without even condescending to look at us. "His Highness feels his poee," carelessly observed the doctor. The rest of the company gave us the ordinary salutation, our guide announcing us beforehand. In answer to our earnest requests to see the Queen, we were now conducted to an edifice, by far the most spacious in the enclosure. It was at least 150 feet in length, very wide, with low eaves, and an exceedingly steep roof of pandanus leaves. There were neither doors nor windows, nothing along the sides but the slight posts supporting the rafters. Between these posts, curtains of fine matting and tappa were rustling all round. Some of them were festooned, or partly withdrawn, so as to admit light and air, and afford a glimpse now and then of what was going on within. Pushing aside one of the screens, we entered. The apartment was one immense hall, the long and lofty ridgepole fluttering with fringed matting and tassels, full 40 feet from the ground. Lounges of mats, piled one upon another, extended on either side; while here and there were slight screens, forming as many recesses, where groups of natives, all females, were reclining at their evening meal. As we advanced, these various parties ceased their buzzing, and in explanation of our appearance among them, listened to a few cabalistic words from our guide. The whole scene was a strange one, but what most excited our surprise was the incongruous assemblage of the most costly objects from all quarters of the globe. Cheek by jowl, they lay beside the rudest native articles without the slightest attempt at order. Superb writing desks of rosewood, inlaid with silver and mother-of-pearl, decanters and goblets of cut glass, embossed volumes of plates, gilded candelabras, sets of globes and mathematical instruments, the finest porcelain, richly mounted sabers and fowling pieces, laced hats and sumptuous garments of all sorts, with numerous other matters of European manufacture, were strewn about among greasy calabashes half filled with poee, rolls of old tappa and matting, paddles and fish-spears, and the ordinary furniture of a Tahitian dwelling. All the articles first mentioned were, doubtless, presents from foreign powers. They were more or less injured. The fowling pieces and swords were rusted. The finest woods were scratched. And a folio volume of Hogarth lay open, with a cocoanut shell of some musty preparation capsized among the miscellaneous furniture of the rake's apartment, where that inconsiderate young gentleman is being measured for a coat. While we were amusing ourselves in this museum of curiosities, our conductor plucked us by the sleeve and whispered, "Pomaree, Pomaree, arm my cow-cow." "She is coming to sup, then," said the doctor, staring in the direction indicated. "What say you, Paul, suppose we step up?" Just then a curtain near by lifted, and from a private building a few yards distant the Queen entered, unattended. She wore a loose gown of blue silk, with two rich shawls, one red and the other yellow, tied about her neck. Her Royal Majesty was barefooted. She was about the ordinary size, rather matronly; her features not very handsome; her mouth voluptuous; but there was a careworn expression in her face, probably attributed to her late misfortunes. From her appearance, one would judge her about 40, but she is not so old. As the Queen approached one of the recesses, her attendants hurried up, escorted her in, and smoothed the mats on which she at last reclined. Two girls soon appeared, carrying their mistress's repast; and then, surrounded by cut glass and porcelain, and jars of sweetmeats and confections, Pomaree Vahinee the First, the titular Queen of Tahiti, ate fish and poee out of her native calabashes, disdaining either knife or spoon. "Come on," whispered Long Ghost, "let's have an audience at once." And he was on the point of introducing himself, when our guide, quite alarmed, held him back, and implored silence. The other natives also interfered; and as he was pressing forward, raised such an outcry that Pomaree lifted her eyes, and saw us for the first. She seemed surprised and offended, and issuing an order in a commanding tone to several of her women, waved us out of the house. Summary as the dismissal was, court etiquette, no doubt, required our compliance. We withdrew, making a profound inclination as we disappeared behind the tappa arras. We departed the grounds without seeking Marbona, and previous to vaulting over the picket, fed our pretty guide after a fashion of our own. Looking round a few moments after, we saw the damsel escorted back by two men, who seemed to have been sent after her. I trust she received nothing more than a reprimand. The next day Popo informed us that strict orders had been issued to admit no strangers within the palace precincts. Chapter 81, which ends the book. Disappointed in going to court, we determined upon going to sea. It would never do longer to trespass on Popo's hospitality, and then, weary somewhat of life in Eimeo, like all sailors ashore, I at last pined for the billows. Now, if her crew were to be credited, the Leviathan was not the craft to our mind. but I had seen the captain and liked him. He was an uncommonly tall, robust, fine-looking man in the prime of life. There was a deep crimson spot in the middle of each sunburnt cheek, doubtless the effect of his sea potations. He was a vineyarder, or native of the island of Martha's Vineyard, adjoining Nantucket, and, I would have sworn it, a sailor and no tyrant. Previous to this, we had rather avoided the Leviathan's men when they came ashore, but now we purposely threw ourselves in their way in order to learn more of the vessel. We became acquainted with a third mate, a Prussian, and an old merchant seaman. A right jolly fellow, with a face like a ruby. We took him to Popo's, and gave him a dinner of baked pig and breadfruit, with pipes and tobacco for dessert. The account he gave us of the ship agreed with my own surmises. A cozier old craft never floated, and the captain was the finest man in the world. There was plenty to eat, too, and, at sea, nothing to do but sit on the windlass and sail. The only bad trait about the vessel was this: she had been launched under some baleful star, and so was a luckless ship in the fishery. She dropped her boats into the brine often enough, and they frequently got fast to the whales, but lance and harpoon almost invariably drew when darted by the men of the Leviathan. But what of that? We would have all the sport of chasing the monsters, with none of the detestable work which follows their capture. So, hurrah for the coast of Japan! Thither the ship was bound. A word now about the hard stories we heard the first time we visited the ship. They were nothing but idle fictions, got up by the sailors for the purpose of frightening us away, so as to oblige the captain, who was in want of more hands, to lie the longer in a pleasant harbor. The next time the vineyarder came ashore, we flung ourselves in his path. When informed of our desire to sail with him, he wanted to know our history, and above all, what countrymen we were. We said that we had left a whaler in Tahiti some time previous, and, since then, had been, in the most praiseworthy manner, employed upon a plantation. As for our country, sailors belonged to no nation in particular. We were, on this occasion, both Yankees. Upon this, he looked decidedly incredulous, and freely told us that he verily believed we were both from Sydney. Be it known here that American sea captains in the Pacific are mortally afraid of these Sydney gentry, who, to tell the truth, wherever known, are in excessively bad odor. Is there a mutiny on board a ship in the South Seas, 10 to 1 a Sydney man is the ringleader. Ashore, these fellows are equally riotous. It was on this account that we were anxious to conceal the fact of our having belonged to the Julia, though it annoyed me much, thus to deny the dashing little craft. For the same reason, also, the doctor fibbed about his birthplace. Unfortunately, one part of our raiment, our Frites blue frocks, was deemed a sort of collateral evidence against us. For, curiously enough, an American sailor is generally distinguished by his red frock, and an English tar by his blue one, thus reversing the national colors. The circumstance was pointed out by the captain, and we quickly explained the anomaly, but in vain. He seemed inveterately prejudiced against us, and, in particular, eyed the doctor most distrustfully. By way of propping the latter's pretensions, I was throwing out a hint concerning Kentucky as a land of tall men, when our vineyarder turned away abruptly, and desired to hear nothing more. It was evident that he took Long Ghost for an exceedingly problematical character. Perceiving this, I resolved to see what a private interview would do. So, one afternoon, I found the captain smoking a pipe in the dwelling of a portly old native, one Mai, who for a reasonable compensation did the honors of Partoowye to illustrious strangers. His guest had just risen from a sumptuous meal of baked pig and taro pudding, and the remnants of the repast were still visible. 2 reeking bottles also, with their necks wrenched off, lay upon the mat. All this was encouraging; for, after a good dinner, one feels affluent and amiable, and particularly open to conviction. So, at all events, I found the noble vineyarder. I began by saying that I called for the purpose of setting him right, touching certain opinions of his concerning the place of my nativity. I was an American, thank heaven, and wanted to convince him of the fact. After looking me in the eye for some time, and by so doing, revealing an obvious unsteadiness in his own visual organs, he begged me to reach forth my arm. I did so, wondering what upon earth that useful member had to do with the matter in hand. He placed his fingers upon my wrist, and, holding them there for a moment, sprang to his feet, and, with much enthusiasm, pronounced me a Yankee every beat of my pulse. "Here, my," he cried, "another bottle!" And when it came, with one stroke of a knife he summarily beheaded it, and commanded me to drain it to the bottom. He then told me that if I would come on board his vessel the following morning I would find the ship's articles on the cabin transom. This was getting along famously, but what was to become of the doctor? I forthwith made an adroit allusion to my long friend, but it was worse than useless. The vineyarder swore he would have nothing to do with him. He, my long friend, was a bird from Sydney, and nothing would make him, the man of little faith, believe otherwise. I could not help loving the free-hearted captain, but indignant at this most unaccountable prejudice against my comrade, I abruptly took leave. Upon informing the doctor of the result of the interview, he was greatly amused, and laughingly declared that the vineyarder must be a penetrating fellow. He then insisted upon my going to sea in the ship, since he well knew how anxious I was to leave. As for himself, on second thoughts, he was no sailor, and although landsmen very often compose part of a whaler's crew, he did not quite relish the idea of occupying a position so humble. In short, he had made up his mind to tarry a while in Eimeo. I turned the matter over, and at last decided upon quitting the island. The impulse urging me to sea once more, and the prospect of eventually reaching home, were too much to be resisted, especially as the Leviathan was so comfortable a craft, was now bound on her last whaling cruise, and, in little more than a year's time, would be going round Cape Horn. I did not, however, covenant to remain in the vessel for the residue of the voyage, which would have been needlessly binding myself. I merely stipulated for the coming cruise, leaving my subsequent movements unrestrained, for there is no knowing that I might not change my mind, and prefer journeying home by short and easy stages. The next day I paddled off to the ship, signed and sealed, and stepped ashore with my advance, 15 Spanish dollars, tasseling the ends of my neck handkerchief. I forced half of the silver on Long Ghost, and having little use for the remainder, would have given it to Po-Po as some small return for his kindness. But although he well knew the value of the coin, not $1 would he accept. In 3 days' time, the Prussian came to Po-Po's and told us that the captain, having made good the number of his crew by shipping several islanders, had determined upon sailing with the land breeze at dawn the following morning. These tidings were received in the afternoon. The doctor immediately disappeared, returning soon after with a couple of flasks of wine concealed in the folds of his frock. Through the agency of the Marquesan, he had purchased them from an understrapper of the court. I prevailed upon Po-Po to drink a parting shell, and even little Loo, actually looking conscious that one of her hopeless admirers was about leaving Partoowye forever, sipped a few drops from a folded leaf. As for the warm-hearted Arfriti, her grief was unbounded. She even besought me to spend my last night under her own palm thatch, and then, in the morning, she would herself paddle me off to the ship. But this I would not consent to, and so, as something to remember her by, she presented me with a roll of fine matting and another of tappa. These gifts, placed in my hammock, I afterwards found very agreeable in the warm latitudes to which we were bound. Nor did they fail to awaken most grateful remembrances. About nightfall we broke away from this generous-hearted household and hurried down to the water. It was a mad, merry night among the sailors. They had on tap a small cask of wine, procured in the same way as the doctor's flasks. An hour or two after midnight everything was noiseless, but when the first streak of the dawn showed itself over the mountains, a sharp voice hailed the forecastle and ordered the ship unmoored. The anchors came up cheerily, the sails were soon set, and with the early breath of the tropical morning, fresh and fragrant from the hillsides, we slowly glided down the bay and were swept through the opening in the reef. Presently we hove to, and the canoes came alongside to take off the islanders who had accompanied us thus far. As he stepped over the side, I shook the doctor long and heartily by the hand. I have never seen or heard of him since. Crowding all sail, we braced the yards square, and, the breeze freshening, bowled straight away from the land. Once more the sailor's cradle rocked under me, and I found myself rolling in my gait. By noon the island had gone down in the horizon, and all before us was the wide Pacific. End of chapters 81 and